Imagine surviving the unimaginable beating cancer, learning to walk again with a prosthetic leg, and facing life's toughest challenges at just 10 years old, only to have your greatest battle come not from illness, but from the very people meant to protect you. This is the haunting story of Zahra Baker, a little girl whose life was marked by resilience, only to be cut short by unimaginable cruelty. Today, we unravel the tragic mystery of how Zara's strength and spirit were stolen from this world, leaving behind more questions than answers. Who failed her? And how could this have happened to such an innocent child? Let's dive into the heartbreaking case of Zahra Baker. Before the tragedy that would later define her story, Zahra Baker's early life was a testament to resilience and courage. Born in Wagga Wagga, Australia, Zahra was like any other lively, adventurous child until her world was turned upside down by a diagnosis no parent ever wants to hear. At just 5 years old, Zahra was diagnosed with bone cancer, a battle that cost her part of her leg and her hearing. But despite these unimaginable setbacks, Zahra wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. With a prosthetic leg and hearing aids, she never let her disabilities define her. Her bright spirit and determination were undeniable even in the face of ongoing treatments and the physical and emotional scars left by cancer. It's important to note that Zara's illness wasn't just a challenge for her, but for her entire family, especially her father, Adam Baker. After Zara's mother left the family when she was still young, Adam became Zara's primary caregiver. He cared for her, uprooting their lives to the United States in search of a better future. The move from Australia to North Carolina, though meant to offer hope, would mark the beginning of a darker chapter in Zara's life. As her health improved, life should have gotten easier for her, but it was here, in a small American town, that Zara's story would take a tragic turn. The struggles she overcame as a child were nothing compared to what awaited her in the years ahead.
When Zahra Baker and her father, Adam, left Australia for the United States, it was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to build a new life away from the shadows of illness. They settled in North Carolina, a world away from the familiar streets of Zahra's hometown. But with this move came more than just new opportunities. It brought a new person into Zahra's life, Elisa Baker, Adam's soon to be wife and Zahra's stepmother.
From the outside, Zara's life may have appeared to improve, but as many would later realize, the Baker household was far from stable. Elisa Baker was a woman with a troubled past, a history of brushes with the law, and a reputation that raised eyebrows among those who knew her. Yet Adam married her, and soon Zara found herself living under the care of a woman who, according to reports, was anything but nurturing. As the family settled into their new life, subtle signs of trouble began to surface. Neighbors recalled how Zara rarely played outside anymore. The once vibrant and lively child who had battled cancer was now seen less and less in public. Elisa, who was known for her volatile temper, seemed to have a particular harshness reserved for Zara. According to witnesses, Zara appeared withdrawn, her cheerful demeanor fading under the weight of something much darker. Bruises began to show up, though always explained away as accidents. And when Zara wasn't in school, she was often kept isolated at home, hidden from the world. Was this just the result of a difficult family adjustment, or were there deeper issues at play? As time went on, it became clear that Zara's life in the US wasn't the fresh start it should have been. Instead, it was the beginning of her isolation, fear, and eventually, her tragic end. What's more chilling is that the warning signs were there all along. But in this small town, people either didn't see them or didn't act fast enough. Zara was slowly slipping through the cracks of a broken system, and no one knew just how much danger she was in. Elisa Baker was not the picture of a loving stepmother. In fact, her troubled past painted a much darker portrait. Born Elisa Fairchild, she had a long history of chaotic relationships, criminal behavior, and questionable life choices. Before meeting Adam Baker, Elisa had been married several times, and those relationships were often marked by conflict and instability. But her tumultuous personal life was only the tip of the iceberg. Elisa's Elisa's criminal record told the story of a woman who had frequently found herself on the wrong side of the law. There were charges of fraud, forgery, and various forms of deception. She was known for using aliases and manipulating those around her. This was not someone with a stable or nurturing background, yet Adam brought her into his life and into Zahra's, seemingly unaware of or indifferent to the red flags that surrounded her. But it wasn't just her criminal history that should have raised alarms. Elisa Baker had a reputation for being volatile and cruel, especially to those weaker than her. Friends and acquaintances described her as having a mean streak with a short temper and a penchant for controlling others. When she moved into the Baker household, she quickly became the dominant force, and Zara, young, vulnerable, and recovering from her battle with cancer, became her target. Elisa's relationship with Zara was fraught with tension from the beginning. Neighbors noticed how Zara, once full of life, seemed to shrink in her presence. It was reported that Elisa often berated Zara, and there were whispered rumors of physical abuse, though nothing concrete was done at the time. Behind closed doors, the control Elisa exerted over Zara seemed absolute. She kept Zara isolated, pulling her out of school and making sure the child had minimal contact with the outside world. The little girl who had already endured so much now had to survive in an environment filled with fear and cruelty. Elisa's troubled past and aggressive behavior were like a ticking time bomb, and in Zara, she found a vulnerable child who couldn't fight back. This power dynamic would play a crucial role in the tragedy that was to come. Elisa wasn't just a bad stepmother, she was a woman capable of extreme cruelty, and as we'll soon see, her actions went far beyond verbal or emotional abuse. How much of her history Adam Baker knew before their marriage remains unclear, but one thing is certain. Elisa Baker was dangerous, and her presence in Zara's life set the stage for the horrific events that followed. October 9th, 2010, what should have been an ordinary day for the Baker family turned into the beginning of a nightmare. That morning, Adam Baker and Elisa Baker called local authorities to report that 10-year-old Zara was missing. Their story was vague, scattered, and left more questions than answers. According to Adam, he had last seen Zara the night before, tucked safely in bed. But by morning, she was gone. Elisa, too, offered little clarity, claiming that Zara had been abducted, possibly in the middle of the night. The police responded quickly, but from the start, something about the baker's version of events felt off. The details of Zara's disappearance didn't align, and the conflicting stories between Adam and Elisa made it hard to establish a clear timeline. Elisa had an unusual addition to her story. She claimed they had found a ransom note that morning. But instead of being for Zara, the note demanded money for Adam's boss, implying some sort of mistaken identity in the kidnapping. The investigation began with frantic searches around the baker's home, but it soon became clear that this wasn't a typical missing child case. The first major red flag came when neighbors and relatives started sharing that they hadn't seen Zara for weeks. Some even admitted that they had been concerned for her safety long before the official report was made. Others pointed out that Elisa had a habit of pulling Zara out of sight, isolating her from the world. How long had Zara truly been missing? Was it possible that she had disappeared long before October 9th, but no one had noticed? As investigators dug deeper, it became harder to ignore the discrepancies between Adam and Elisa's accounts. Adam, who seemed bewildered and distraught, claimed he had no idea what had happened to his daughter. But Elisa's erratic behavior only deepened suspicion. The ransom note she mentioned turned out to be a clumsy fake, a bizarre and obvious lie that immediately pointed the finger back at her. Public interest in Zara's disappearance grew rapidly. The media picked up on the story, drawn in by the shocking combination of Zara's health struggles, her resilience, and the dark mystery surrounding her vanishing. Soon, the case was on national news, with people everywhere asking the same questions: where was Zara? and why did the story of her disappearance make so little sense? With every passing day, the hope of finding Zahra alive diminished. The investigation, once focused on finding a missing girl, began shifting towards uncovering what had really happened behind the walls of the Baker home. The truth was darker than anyone could have imagined, and it wasn't long before the investigation took a turn that shocked the nation. As soon as Zara was reported missing, local law enforcement launched an exhaustive search operation, desperate to find the 10-year-old girl who had already endured so much in her short life. The community of Hickory, North Carolina, rallied behind the search efforts, with volunteers joining law enforcement to comb through nearby forests, fields, and neighborhoods. Flyers with Zara's bright smile were posted all over town, and news outlets amplified the urgency of the situation. But almost from the beginning, the search was fraught with difficulties, not because of the terrain or weather, but because of the people closest to Zara. Elisa Baker, in particular, quickly emerged as an unreliable source of information. Her story shifted multiple times during the initial days of the search. She alternated between claiming that Zara had been kidnapped and suggesting that perhaps Zara had run away. Each new version of events cast doubt on her credibility, leaving law enforcement frustrated and the community growing more suspicious. Adam Baker, on the other hand, maintained that he had no knowledge of Zara's whereabouts and insisted that he believed Elisa's version of events despite the mounting inconsistencies. His apparent detachment and lack of direct involvement in the search raised further concerns among investigators and the public. How could a father be so disconnected from the search for his own child? Investigators continued their search, but the lack of cooperation from both Adam and Alyssa slowed down their progress. It became clear that this wasn't a case of a missing child who had wandered off. The more law enforcement pressed for details, the more evasive Alyssa became, often breaking down in tears or deflecting questions. At one point, she was even arrested on unrelated charges, a tactic authorities hoped might pressure her into revealing more about Zara's disappearance. But even in custody, Alyssa remained tight-lipped, only adding to the mystery with vague, inconsistent claims. The investigation was further complicated by Zara's unique situation. With her prosthetic leg and hearing aids, it seemed unlikely that she could have disappeared without help or intervention. This raised more questions about the involvement of those inside the home. The search moved from hope to dread as days passed with no sign of Zara, and the likelihood of finding her alive grew smaller with each passing hour. Despite the roadblocks, law enforcement pushed forward. Investigators began to focus less on finding Zara wandering somewhere outside and more on searching for evidence that might explain what had truly happened inside the Baker household. Alyssa's lies and erratic behavior had created an atmosphere of suspicion so thick that it was impossible to ignore. The case was no longer just a missing person investigation. It was becoming clear that something far more sinister had taken place. The community's hope of finding Zara alive was fading, and soon the search would take a devastating turn. The search for Zahra Baker took a harrowing turn on October 24, 2010, when Elisa Baker, who had been a source of suspicion from the start, finally cracked under the pressure of relentless questioning. What she confessed left investigators and the public stunned and horrified. In a calm and detached manner, Elisa admitted that Zara was no longer missing. In fact, she was dead. But the shock didn't end there. Alyssa went on to describe how she had dismembered Zara's body and scattered her remains in multiple locations across the area. According to Alyssa, Zara had died accidentally, though the details of this so-called accident remained vague and highly questionable. She claimed that Zara had fallen ill and passed away unexpectedly, and in a panic, rather than report her death, she and Adam had decided to cover it up. Elisa insisted that Adam was aware of everything, though he continued to deny any involvement. The confession quickly shifted the investigation from a search and rescue mission to a search for Zahra's remains. Elisa provided investigators with the gruesome details of where she had disposed of the child's body, sending law enforcement on a heartbreaking journey to retrieve whatever was left of the little girl. Elisa's confession didn't just break the case wide open, it also shattered any remaining hope of finding Zahra alive. The gruesome reality of her death, particularly the manner in which her remains were treated, shocked the community and outraged the nation. How could someone claim to love a child and yet desecrate her body in such a cold and calculated way? Investigators, while horrified by what they had learned, still had many questions. Was Zara's death truly an accident, or was Elisa trying to minimize her guilt with this narrative? The fact that she had gone to such extreme lengths to hide Zara's body suggested there was more to the story than Elisa was letting on. Even more chilling was the possibility that Zara's dismemberment might have been a way for Elisa to conceal the true cause of her death, perhaps hiding evidence of long term abuse or something far worse. The public reaction to Elisa's confession was one of disbelief and outrage. This was no longer just a case of a missing child, it had become something far more disturbing. Vigils were held for Zara, and the community mourned the loss of a child they had never really known, but whose story had touched their hearts. Parents everywhere were left grappling with the unthinkable. How could this have happened to such a vulnerable, innocent girl? How could the system have failed her so completely? The police, now armed with Elisa's confession, began the grim task of recovering Zara's remains, but they knew that Elisa was not telling the full truth. Her claims of an accidental death didn't align with her decision to mutilate the child's body and hide it. Investigators pressed forward, determined to uncover the full scope of the horror that had occurred in the Baker household. Following Elisa Baker's chilling confession, investigators were tasked with a grim and daunting mission to recover the remains of 10-year-old Zahra Baker. Elisa, in her coldly matter-of-fact way, directed them to multiple locations where she had scattered Zahra's dismembered body. This phase of the investigation was not only heartbreaking but also complex, as the locations were spread across rural areas, making the search painstakingly difficult. On October 26th, just days after Elisa's confession, investigators made their first discovery. A bone, later confirmed to belong to Zahra, was found in a remote area. As the days passed, more of her remains were uncovered in separate locations, scattered like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Investigators found parts of Zara's prosthetic leg and hearing aids, a grim reminder of the little girl who had fought so hard for survival only to meet such a cruel fate. The discovery of Zara's remains wasn't just an emotional blow to the community, it also reshaped the entire investigation. What had begun as a search for a missing child was now indisputably a murder case with a gruesome twist. The meticulous manner in which Zara's body had been dismembered suggested a deliberate effort to conceal the crime. For investigators, this raised a new set of pressing questions. If Zara's death had truly been an accident, why go to such extremes to hide her body? The scattered remains made it clear that Elisa and possibly others had taken considerable steps to cover up what had happened. As the remains were slowly recovered, forensic experts worked to piece together not just the physical evidence, but the story behind Zara's death. The discovery of her body parts, especially the prosthetic leg and hearing aids, was a gut-wrenching reminder of how vulnerable Zara had been. The investigation was no longer just about finding her remains, it became a quest for the truth, a drive to understand what had really happened in the final moments of Zara's life. This recovery process also brought Adam Baker back into the spotlight. While Elisa had taken responsibility for the dismemberment, many wondered how a father could remain so distant from the investigation into his daughter's death. Adam continued to maintain his innocence, claiming he had no idea what had happened to Zara. but the discovery of her remains in such scattered, concealed locations only intensified suspicions around his possible involvement or, at the very least, his negligence. How could he not have known that his daughter had been dead for so long and that her body had been discarded in such a horrific way? The recovery of Zara's remains brought both closure and devastation. The search for her had ended, but the real questions about how she died and who was responsible were only just beginning. With each new discovery, the investigators' resolve to uncover the full truth strengthened. Zara's remains were no longer just evidence, they were a silent testament to the horrors she had endured. And now, more than ever, the world demanded justice for Zahra Baker. When Zahra Baker's remains were finally recovered, the next critical step was the autopsy and examination that would hopefully answer the most pressing question. How did this 10-year-old girl, already a survivor of cancer and unimaginable hardships, meet such a tragic and violent end? Zara's body had been dismembered and scattered, complicating the forensic examination. However, the pathologists worked meticulously to gather every possible detail from what little remained of her. The autopsy results, though far from complete due to the state of Zara's remains, painted a grim picture. There was no conclusive evidence that Zara had died from natural causes or any illness. This finding directly contradicted Elisa Baker's claim that Zara had passed away from an accidental illness or fall. In fact, the condition of the body made it difficult to determine a precise cause of death, which raised immediate suspicions that her death had been far from accidental. Pathologists noted that the dismemberment had occurred post-mortem, which suggested that Elisa and potentially others had gone to great lengths to dispose of Zara's body in a manner that would obscure the true cause of her death. The autopsy also revealed signs of long-term physical abuse. Zara had suffered repeated injuries over time, some of which may have occurred while she was alive. These findings led investigators to the chilling conclusion that Zara's final days were likely filled with suffering. Elisa's confession of an accidental death seemed less believable with each new piece of evidence. Although the autopsy couldn't definitively point to the exact moment or manner of Zara's death, the signs of abuse and the extreme measures taken to hide her body strongly suggested that something far more sinister had taken place. Elisa's narrative of an accidental death was increasingly seen as an attempt to minimize her role in what had happened and possibly to shield Adam Baker from scrutiny as well. The absence of conclusive proof of illness or accident left investigators and the public questioning whether Zara had been murdered to hide the years of abuse she had endured. Speculation arose that Elisa's confession, while shocking, was only a partial truth. If Zara's death had been accidental, why not call the authorities immediately? Why go to such gruesome lengths to cover it up? And why had Adam Baker, Zara's father, remained so passive during the entire ordeal? Did he truly know nothing, or was he involved in the cover-up? These unanswered questions deepened the mystery surrounding Zara's death. The autopsy, while it couldn't provide all the answers, was a crucial turning point in the case. It confirmed what many had feared. Zara had not died peacefully, nor had her death been the result of a simple accident. The physical evidence of abuse and the deliberate dismemberment of her body hinted at a much darker reality, one that investigators were determined to uncover piece by piece. Zara's death was no longer a tragic accident. It was beginning to look like a case of prolonged abuse that had ended in murder. The next step for investigators was to untangle the web of lies and deception spun by Elisa Baker and to determine just how much Adam Baker knew about the horrors that had unfolded in their home. Adam Baker, Zara's father, became a central figure in the investigation as soon as the true horror of Zara's death was revealed. From the beginning, Adam presented himself as a bewildered, grief-stricken father, one who claimed to have no knowledge of the abuse Zara suffered or her tragic end. But as investigators began to unravel the complexities of the case, they were faced with the critical question: was Adam Baker truly unaware of the nightmare his daughter lived through, or was he complicit, either by negligence or something far worse? Adam had been Zara's primary caregiver for most of her life, especially after her mother left when Zara was just an infant. By all accounts, Adam had stood by his daughter during her battle with cancer, moving with her from Australia to the United States in hopes of giving her a better life. But his decision to marry Elisa Baker, a woman with a troubled past and a known history of manipulation and violence, cast a dark shadow over his judgment as a parent. How could he not have seen the warning signs that Elisa was dangerous? Throughout the investigation, Adam maintained that he had no idea Zara was being abused and denied any involvement in her death or dismemberment. He pointed to his work schedule, explaining that he often worked long hours, leaving Zara alone with Elisa. But this excuse did little to absolve him in the eyes of the public or investigators. If he was gone so often, had he simply chosen to ignore the signs of Zara's suffering? Or was his trust in Elisa so blind that he never suspected what was happening behind closed doors? There were reports from neighbors and friends suggesting that Adam had been aware of some of Elisa's mistreatment of Zara, but he had chosen not to intervene. Some recalled seeing bruises on Zara, while others mentioned that the little girl had spoken about harsh punishments. Yet Adam had done nothing to protect her. Was it denial, fear of Elisa's volatile temper, or was it something more sinister? Even more troubling was Adam's behavior after Zara was reported missing. His initial reaction appeared strangely detached, almost passive. He didn't actively participate in the search efforts for his daughter, and his interviews with police lacked the urgency and desperation one might expect from a parent whose child had vanished. This indifference led many to question whether Adam knew more than he was letting on. If Elisa was the one responsible for Zara's death, did Adam help cover it up, or did he simply look the other way? During Elisa's confession, she implicated Adam by suggesting that he knew about Zara's death and helped conceal it. Yet, despite this accusation, Adam continued to insist he was innocent. He claimed that Elisa manipulated and lied to him, much as she had to the authorities. Still, the question lingered: could a father truly be so unaware of his own child's abuse and eventual death? Investigators were left with conflicting views on Adam's role. On one hand, there was no direct evidence tying him to Zara's murder or the dismemberment of her body. On the other hand, his failure to act on clear signs of abuse, coupled with his emotionally distant behavior, left a cloud of suspicion hanging over him. Was he simply a father who had trusted the wrong person, or had his negligence crossed the line into complicity? In the end, Adam Baker was never charged in connection to Zara's death. Yet many, including those in the community and even some investigators, couldn't shake the feeling that he bore some responsibility, if not for her death, then for the years of suffering she endured under his roof. Zara's life was one filled with pain and resilience, but ultimately she had been failed by the people who were supposed to protect her. And Adam's role in that failure, whether by negligence or indifference, would haunt this case forever. As investigators delved deeper into Zahra Baker's tragic life, a grim picture of long term abuse began to emerge. The signs had been there all along, signs of both physical and emotional abuse inflicted by Elisa Baker, Zahra's stepmother. The question that haunted everyone involved in the case was simple yet devastating. How was this abuse missed, and why did no one step in to save Zahra? Zahra had endured unimaginable hardships from an early age, battling cancer, losing part of her leg, and facing hearing loss. But after she moved to North Carolina with her father and stepmother, it became clear that her greatest challenges were not behind her. Those who had contact with Zahra began to recall moments that, in hindsight, should have raised alarms. Neighbors, teachers, and even family members noticed disturbing changes in her appearance and behavior, but somehow no one acted quickly enough to prevent what was to come. Physically, Zara showed clear signs of mistreatment. Neighbors reported seeing her with unexplained bruises on multiple occasions. Elisa often brushed these off with flimsy excuses, claiming Zara was clumsy or had fallen. But the pattern of injuries pointed to something far more sinister than childhood accidents. Bruises on her face, arms, and legs were too frequent to ignore, yet they went unreported. One neighbor recounted seeing Zara walking with an unusual stiffness, which suggested she had been injured more seriously than Elisa was willing to admit. Emotionally, Zara's behavior reflected the trauma she was living through. Teachers and classmates described her as quiet and withdrawn, a stark contrast to the brave, resilient child she had been during her battle with cancer. Zara's spark had dimmed, and she rarely smiled or spoke openly. Elisa's control over Zara was suffocating. She kept Zara isolated, pulling her out of school and limiting her interactions with the outside world. This isolation made it nearly impossible for anyone to understand the full scope of what Zara was enduring. Despite these signs, Zara's abuse went unchecked. The system failed her at every level. Neighbors, though suspicious, never made formal reports. Perhaps they didn't want to interfere, or maybe they believed Elisa's excuses. Zara's teachers were also aware of her struggles, but with her frequent absences from school, they couldn't track the changes in her behavior as closely as they might have under normal circumstances. Even family members who sensed something was wrong remained silent, either out of fear of Alyssa's volatile temper or because they too were convinced by her manipulative explanations. But the most glaring failure came from Child Protective Services, who had been involved with the family at different points but had failed to intervene decisively. Whether it was due to lack of resources, poor communication, or simply falling through the cracks of a broken system, Zara's case slipped away from their attention. There were red flags, but no one seemed to connect the dots or realize the danger she was in. In hindsight, it's clear that multiple opportunities to save Zara were missed. The bruises, her emotional withdrawal, and her growing isolation all pointed to an escalating situation, yet the system failed to protect her. The blame doesn't fall on one person or entity, it falls on a combination of failures. Zara needed someone to advocate for her, someone to recognize the pattern of abuse and step in before it was too late. But by the time the extent of her suffering was realized, it was far too late to save her. Her case serves as a heartbreaking reminder of how easy it is for abused children to fall through the cracks, especially when the abuser is someone close to them. Zara's stepmother controlled every aspect of her life, using fear and manipulation to silence her. The signs were there clear, loud, and heartbreaking, but Zara was left to face her abuser alone, with no one stepping in to pull her out of the nightmare. When the full extent of Zahra Baker's tragic death came to light, it seemed inevitable that Elisa Baker would face severe legal consequences. However, the charges brought against her, while significant, left many feeling that justice had only been partially served. Despite the horrific nature of Zahra's death and dismemberment, the court ultimately chose not to pursue first-degree murder charges against Elisa, a decision that outraged many who followed the case closely. Initially, Elisa Baker was charged with obstruction of justice after it was discovered that she had forged a ransom note during the early stages of Zahra's disappearance. This charge was a precursor to much more serious legal action, as investigators gathered enough evidence to tie Elisa directly to Zahra's death. Over time, additional charges were filed, including felony charges of concealing a death, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and abuse of a corpse. However, the most significant charge came in February 2011 when Elisa Baker was officially indicted for second-degree murder. The second-degree murder charge indicated that while Elisa had caused Zara's death, it was not premeditated. This decision was controversial, as many believed that Elisa's actions, both in her abuse of Zara and her cold, calculated dismemberment of the child's body, warranted a first-degree murder charge. Prosecutors, however, felt they had insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Elisa had planned Zahra's death in advance. A key factor in this decision was Elisa's own confession. She claimed that Zahra's death had been an accident, and while her credibility was highly questionable, the lack of direct forensic evidence linking Elisa to a premeditated murder made it difficult to charge her with first-degree murder. Additionally, Elisa had cooperated with investigators in leading them to Zahra's remains, which influenced the prosecution's approach. Facing overwhelming evidence of her involvement in Zahra's death, Elisa Baker accepted a plea deal in September 2011. In exchange for her cooperation and guilty plea to second-degree murder, the court agreed to drop some of the additional charges, including the charges related to concealing Zahra's death. As part of the plea deal, Elisa was sentenced to between 18 and 24 years in prison for Zahra's murder. This outcome, though it brought some closure to the case, was met with widespread outrage. Many felt that the plea deal allowed Elisa to escape full accountability for the unspeakable cruelty she had inflicted on Zahra. The fact that she would not face a first-degree murder conviction despite the fact that she had dismembered and scattered Zahra's body felt like an injustice to many who had followed the case from the beginning. Zahra's death, they believed, deserved the harshest possible penalty. The plea deal also highlighted the limitations of the legal system in cases like Zahra's, where abuse and neglect were prolonged, but the actual cause of death remained unclear. Without definitive proof of premeditation, the court was limited in how it could prosecute Elisa. Nevertheless, the sentence of up to 24 years in prison meant that Elisa would serve significant time behind bars, though some would argue it wasn't nearly enough for the pain and horror she had caused. In the aftermath of the plea deal, questions lingered about why Elisa had been allowed to strike a deal in the first place. Was it simply a matter of ensuring a conviction, or was it because the prosecution didn't believe they could win a first-degree murder case? Either way, the legal outcome left a bitter taste for those who had hoped to see Elisa held fully responsible for the death of a little girl who had already suffered so much. Zahra Baker's story resonated deeply with people around the world, and the public's reaction to her tragic death was one of overwhelming grief, anger, and disbelief. From the moment her disappearance became national news, Zahra's face was on every screen, her heartbreaking backstory stirring emotions in every household that learned of her case. The media, captivated by the details of her short, troubled life, covered the case extensively, focusing on both her remarkable resilience and the horror of her death. News outlets delved into Zahra's battles with cancer, her move from Australia to the US, and the shocking abuse she had endured at the hands of her stepmother, Elisa Baker. As details of the investigation unfolded, particularly the revelation of Zahra's dismemberment, public outrage reached a fever pitch. Social media erupted with calls for justice, and the case became a national conversation about child abuse, neglect, and the systemic failures that allowed such a tragedy to happen. Vigils were held across North Carolina and even as far away as Australia, Zahra's home country. People gathered to mourn a child they had never met, lighting candles and sharing stories about how Zahra's strength had touched them, even in death. The overwhelming sentiment was one of sadness mixed with anger that a child who had survived so much could be failed so completely by the very people meant to protect her. The public outcry also centered around the perceived failure of authorities to act sooner. How had Zara's suffering gone unnoticed for so long? Why hadn't the system intervened before it was too late? These were the questions that haunted the media coverage and public discussions. Zara's case became a rallying cry for child protection reform, with many demanding stricter oversight of children in at-risk situations and more accountability for social services. For Zara's biological family back in Australia, the public attention was both a source of comfort and pain. They had loved Zara from afar, and to see the world mourn her loss alongside them was touching. But the fact that Zara's suffering had gone unnoticed for so long only deepened their grief. The global media attention ensured that Zahra's story would not be forgotten, but it also left a lingering question: could this tragedy have been prevented? As investigators pieced together Zara's final months, it became painfully clear that there had been several missed opportunities, moments where intervention might have saved her life. Elisa Baker's history of abusive behavior was well documented, and there were multiple warning signs that Zara was in danger, yet no decisive action had been taken until it was too late. Neighbors had reported seeing Zara with bruises, and some had even heard disturbing sounds coming from the Baker household. But those concerns had either not been reported to authorities or they were not acted upon in a timely manner. Teachers had also noticed Zara's frequent absences from school and her increasingly withdrawn behavior, but these red flags were never followed up with proper investigations. Even Child Protective Services, which had been involved with the family at different points, failed to intervene effectively. Zara's case had slipped through the cracks of a system stretched too thin and perhaps too indifferent to truly recognize the danger she was in. Elisa Baker's manipulative and controlling behavior kept Zara isolated, but the signs of abuse were there for those who were paying attention.
One of the most glaring missed opportunities came when Elisa forged a ransom note after Zara's disappearance. The authorities quickly saw through the lie, and while it heightened suspicion around Elisa, it also signaled that something much darker was at play. Had investigators pressed harder, they might have uncovered the truth about Zara's death sooner. But Alyssa's deception and the complexity of the case allowed her to continue hiding the full extent of her crimes for far too long.
In retrospect, the system failed Zara at every turn. The abuse, the isolation, the neglect, all of it had been visible in one form or another. Yet no one stepped in to remove her from the dangerous environment she was living in. Zara's tragic death highlighted the critical need for better communication between schools, social services, and law enforcement, as well as a more proactive approach to child welfare cases. In September 2011, Elisa Baker stood before the court and was sentenced to between 18 and 24 years in prison for second-degree murder. Her guilty plea, part of a deal struck with prosecutors, ensured that she would serve significant time behind bars, but it also meant she avoided a trial and the possibility of a harsher first-degree murder charge. Many viewed the plea deal as a bittersweet outcome, justice perhaps, but not to the full extent that Zara's death warranted. Elisa's sentence brought some closure to the case, but for Zara's biological family and the public, it wasn't enough. The fact that she could one day walk free left many feeling that justice had only been partially served. Zara's father, Adam Baker, had faced no charges related to his daughter's death, despite lingering suspicions that his negligence or complicity may have played a role. His life, however, was irrevocably changed. He returned to Australia shortly after the sentencing, avoiding the media spotlight and trying to rebuild his life away from the tragedy that had consumed him. For Zara's biological family, the aftermath of the case was one of deep, unresolved pain. Zara's mother, who had been estranged from her for most of her life, was devastated by the news of her daughter's death. She had lost the opportunity to reconnect with Zara, and the details of her suffering haunted her. Zara's extended family in Australia continued to grieve, torn between mourning and anger over the failures that led to her death. Elisa's time in prison was marked by further controversy. Though she was serving time for Zara's murder, she continued to manipulate those around her, even within the prison system. There were reports of her causing problems with other inmates and staff, showcasing the same controlling and deceitful behavior that had defined her life before incarceration. The case of Zahra Baker left a permanent scar on the community and a lasting legacy in the realm of child protection. Her death served as a wake-up call for the need to reform child welfare systems, particularly in cases involving step-parents or other caregivers with troubling histories. Zahra's name became synonymous with the fight to protect vulnerable children, and while justice may not have been served in full, her story continues to remind the world of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and intervention in the lives of at risk children. As Zahra Baker's story unfolded, one of the most glaring questions was, where was Child Protective Services CPS throughout this ordeal? Given the signs of abuse, the repeated reports of bruises, and Zara's increasingly isolated life, many expected that CPS would have intervened sooner, perhaps saving her from the tragic end she met. But Zara's case highlighted the painful reality of a system stretched too thin and burdened by too many cases, leading to fatal oversights. There were instances when CPS had been made aware of the Baker household. Reports of potential abuse had reached their offices, and at least once investigators visited the home. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear, no decisive action was taken. Whether it was due to incomplete information, manipulation by Elisa Baker, or simply the limitations of a system overwhelmed by cases, CPS failed to recognize the severity of Zara's situation. CPS workers are often tasked with making difficult judgment calls in complex situations, but Zara's case underscored the consequences of failing to act. The signs were there. Zara was being isolated, frequently absent from school, and showing physical signs of abuse. And yet, despite these glaring red flags, Zara was allowed to remain in a home where she was in constant danger. The failure of CPS to intervene before Zara's death prompted a larger conversation about child welfare in America. How many other children were slipping through the cracks? Zara's case became a symbol of these systemic shortcomings, raising the alarm for reforms aimed at improving how child protection agencies operate. The need for better training, more thorough investigations, and increased funding to alleviate the burden on CPS workers became part of the public dialogue following her death. When looking back on Zahra Baker's case, the question that haunts everyone is, what could have been done differently to save her? It's easy, in hindsight, to see the missed opportunities and red flags, but the critical issue lies in how those in her life, both individuals and institutions, could have intervened. First and foremost, a more robust response from Child Protective Services might have changed the outcome. Had CPS acted on the reports of bruises and neglect with more urgency, they could have removed Zara from the toxic environment that led to her death. More thorough investigations, particularly into Elisa Baker's background and her history of abuse, might have revealed the danger Zara was in. Schools, too, played a pivotal role in Zara's life. While teachers did notice her growing absence and emotional withdrawal, stronger communication between schools and child protection services might have provided a clearer picture of the danger. Teachers, who are often the front line of defense for at risk children, could have done more to escalate their concerns, perhaps prompting more immediate action. Additionally, Zara's neighbors and community members had noticed signs of trouble. In a small town, it can be easy to overlook or explain away domestic issues, especially when the abuser is manipulative and controlling, as Elisa was. But the community could have done more, reports could have been made sooner, and more pressure placed on authorities to investigate. Zara's suffering was visible to those around her, but the steps taken to address it were simply not enough. In the end, Zara's case is a painful lesson in the importance of vigilance and proactive intervention. Her death revealed the cracks in a system that, with better coordination and resources, might have saved her. Going forward, Zara's story serves as a stark reminder of the need for continuous improvements in how we protect the most vulnerable among us. Zahra Baker's death sent shockwaves through communities not just in North Carolina but across the world. Her tragic story sparked a heightened awareness of child abuse and the responsibilities of both individuals and institutions to act when a child is in danger. Zara's legacy is not just one of loss and heartbreak, it is also a call to action. In the years following Zara's death, her case became a catalyst for reforms aimed at improving child abuse reporting and intervention protocols. Public awareness campaigns focused on educating the public about the signs of abuse, encouraging people to report suspicions more proactively. Schools were urged to strengthen their communication with child protection agencies, ensuring that no child could fall through the cracks as Zahra had. For law enforcement, Zara's case served as a wake up call regarding the importance of thorough investigations when dealing with missing children and abuse allegations. Training was improved in some areas, focusing on how to spot and respond to child neglect and isolation, two key elements of Zara's suffering that had gone largely unnoticed. Most importantly, Zara's story touched the hearts of people everywhere, reminding them of the importance of community vigilance. Zahra Baker should never have had to endure the abuse she did, and in her name, child welfare advocates continue to push for stronger protections and more resources to support children in need. Despite the conviction of Elisa Baker and the recovery of Zara's remains, several unanswered questions continue to linger, casting shadows over the case. One of the biggest mysteries revolves around Adam Baker's role in Zara's life and death. Could Zara's father truly have been unaware of the abuse she suffered at the hands of his wife? While Adam was never charged, many still wonder how he could have missed the warning signs that were so apparent to others. Some theorize that Adam may have been in denial, unwilling to confront the reality of what was happening in his home. Others believe he may have been more complicit than he let on, perhaps turning a blind eye to the abuse or even participating in covering up Zara's death. Though Elisa pointed the finger at Adam during her confession, he maintained his innocence throughout, leaving the public to speculate about his true involvement. Another lingering question revolves around whether Elisa Baker acted alone. Given her history of manipulation and violence, it is plausible that she orchestrated the crime herself. But could someone else have played a part in Zara's death? Investigators looked into other potential accomplices, but no charges were ever brought. The extent of Elisa's cruelty and the nature of Zara's death leave open the possibility that we may never know the full truth. These unanswered questions continue to haunt those who followed the case, casting doubt on whether justice was fully served for Zara. Zahra Baker's life was short, marked by unimaginable suffering, but it was also a life of resilience and courage. Despite the hardships she faced surviving cancer, living with a disability, and enduring abuse, Zahra never lost her spirit. Her tragic death has left an indelible mark on all who learned of her story, a haunting reminder of the consequences of silence and inaction in the face of abuse. As we reflect on Zara's legacy, it's impossible not to feel a deep sense of sorrow for what she endured and for the opportunities missed to save her. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we, as a society, protect or fail to protect our most vulnerable children. It challenges us to do better, to be more vigilant, and to never turn a blind eye to signs of suffering. Zara's memory will live on, not only in the lessons her case has taught us, but in the hearts of those who continue to fight for the protection of children. Her legacy is one of awareness, of the need for systemic change, and of the responsibility we all share in ensuring that no child is left to face abuse alone. In remembering Zara, we honor her strength and we recommit ourselves to the fight against child abuse so that no child's story ends as tragically as hers did.